Hello YouTube, welcome to my channel. My name is Robert and today is a very special day. At the time of this recording it is November 11th 2022, Remembrance Day in Canada, a day that marked the end of World War I. It's also to remember all those soldiers who lost their lives in all the world's conflicts throughout the years. So I thought that I would do a special video on this, and so here we go.
Sorry, not sorry. While Canadians are nowadays subject to the stereotype of hockey-loving, maple syrup-chugging, overly polite potheads, their wartime stereotypes in the First and Second World Wars had their enemies trembling in their boots and making a hot mess in their trousers. It's as if, when the Canadians hear the word war, their insatiable desire for maple syrup and Canadian beer turns into an insatiable desire for blood. In saying that, however, they didn't always rush enemy positions with bayonets To get the puck sliding, let's move our scope quickly to the First World War, in which the Canadians laid the groundwork for their reputation as shock troopers. Mostly, the troops of the Canadian Corps were known for their savage raids on enemy trenches and their unwritten take no prisoner and kill the wounded policies. Locked in a stalemate in opposing trenches, the Canadians devised all manner of strategies and weaponry to flip the chessboard upside down and clean up the enemy pieces. Cutting through barbed wire, they crept upon them in the cover of night with painted faces, launching either savage, unforeshadowed raids or perking up their ears and eavesdropping on enemy plans. In said raids, the Canadians gorged their bayonets with blood and made good use of improvised melee weapons, paying little attention to attempts at surrender and skewering bandaged and unarmed men just the same as men on their feet with rifles. They even concocted an alchemist's shelf of homebrew explosives, like pipe bombs and jam jars loaded with nails and gunpowder. I think it's a safe bet to say that at least one grenade is made with a maple syrup jar. There are also tales of Canadian troops using temporary truces, like on Christmas Day, as a chance to catch their enemy with his stockings on, sending him grenades instead of Christmas ham, and bullets through the brain instead of season's greetings. Now, it could be argued that Canadians were acting out.
It's not really funny, but it is a little bit that, season greetings, bang, it's like, that's how you get the war won,
Out of vengeance, but couldn't that argument be used to justify most atrocities in most wars? Canadian Lieutenant R.C. Germain's letter home to his parents makes the revenge excuse about as clear as the sap from a freshly tapped maple tree. After losing half of my company there, we rushed them, and they had the nerve to throw up their hands and cry "Camarade." All the camarade they got was a foot of cold steel, while I blew their brains out with my revolver. Despite being a little stab-happy with enemy soldiers, Canadian troops were known for being quite, as we contemporary folk have come to expect, polite to civilian populations. Before we have a look at Canadian reputation in World War II and some of its stories, it might pay to know about Canada's involvement in the war.
Oh, that bugs me so much. I have never heard any of my fellow Canadians say a boot. Stop it. It's about.
Canada waited until the 10th of September 1939 to declare war in Germany because it didn't want to follow Britain like a Commonwealth sheep. It took Canada until the 11th of June 1940 to declare war on Italy and the 7th of December 1941 to declare it on Japan.
Yeah, the day Pearl Harbor was attacked, Canada declared war on Japan. Yeah.
Overall, about 10% of Canada's population fought for her and the Allies. This amounted to around 1,100,000 Canadians serving in the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. Of this 1,100,000, the majority were volunteers. Canadians fought in almost every theatre of World War II, notably in the defence of the United Kingdom, the Battle of Hong Kong, the Dieppe Raid, the invasions of Sicily and Italy, the Normandy landings and the liberation of France, and the liberation of Belgium and the Netherlands. The Canadian Navy escorted Allied ships across the Atlantic and maintained a high presence in the Pacific Ocean, and pilots from the Canadian Air Force flew under the wing of the British Royal Air Force. German submarines sunk Canadian naval and merchant vessels in the water of Canada and Newfoundland and attacked the loading pier at Bell Island. And the Japanese also attacked a lighthouse on Vancouver Island, though little else occurred in Canadian waters or on mainland Canada. Of the military operations in which Canadians were involved, their ferocity and inventiveness stood out in the Battle of Ortona, the Normandy landings, and the liberation of Belgium and the Netherlands. Through the medieval streets of Ortona, Italy, the Canadians and Germans engaged in brutal room-to-room, hand-to-hand fighting, with the Germans eventually having to withdraw. Here, the Canadians coined the tactic mouse holding, which is basically blowing holes in buildings to allow the passage of infantry rather than running into enemy bullets in the open. In the D-Day landings, the Canadians landed on Juno Beach, the second most resisted beachhead besides Omaha. The Canadians penetrated further inland than anyone else, coming up against some of the strongest units in the German military. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the Canadians spent thousands and thousands of Canadian lives to drive the Germans back and get food to the starving civilian populations. They even shared rations with civilians and gave them blankets. Some of the most intense combat here was in the Battle of Scheldt, where the Allies fought through flooded terrain against stiff German defences for about a month. This battle alone cost the Canadians more than 6,000 casualties. This latter triumph, particularly the part about getting food to the starving civilians, is certainly keeping with Canadian tendencies in the First World War, though the following atrocity paints a bit of a different picture. Canadian Lieutenant Colonel Frederick E. Wiggle was shot dead on approach to the town of Friseute, Germany, and a rumor spread that it was a civilian sniper from that town who shot him. Back on that revenge train, the Canadians burnt down the entire town, apparently moving its citizens onward before setting their homes on fire. It was discovered later that Wiggle was shot by German soldiers. Now, the intent of emphasizing Canadian brutality in World War I and mentioning the Friseute incident is not to take away from Canadian bravery in either world conflict. Like I said before, Canadians were some of the most well-trained and formidable soldiers on any front in any war, and I think the best way to communicate that is to share some stories involving some of the most heroic Canadian soldiers in World War II. On the 14th of December 1943, Canadian Captain Paul Triquet and his company, supported by an armoured squadron, tried to cross the gully and take the Casa Berardi, a hamlet on the Orto Orsona lateral, Italy. Under heavy machine gun and mortar fire, Triquet ran around organising and inspiring what remained of his men, saying, "There are enemy in front of us, behind us and on our flanks. There is only one safe place. That is on the objective," before charging forward and breaking through the enemy line. Triquet's company and the supporting tank squadron pushed right up to the edge of Casa Berardi, where he set up defences and fought off a tank-supported German counterattack with whatever weapons he could find. He held the defensive parameter against superior numbers until the rest of the battalion came in and relieved the company. Triquet's utter disregard of danger, his cheerfulness and tireless devotion inspired his men, and his tactical skill and leadership facilitated the capture at a vital point on the Ortona Orsona lateral. On the 18th of August 1944, Canadian Major David Vivian Currie was in command of a force of tanks, self-propelled anti-tank guns and infantry. His task was to block an escape route from the Falaise pocket in the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Divers, Normandy. Currie went in alone to scout German defences and to free the crew of 2 Allied tanks which were previously disabled. Under heavy mortar fire, he succeeded. The Germans then kept throwing counterattacks at Currie and his men Until on the 20th, one final German counterattack was thwarted by Currie, costing the Germans some 2,900 casualties. Throughout these 3 days of intense combat, Currie displayed gallant conduct and a contempt of danger and collected and inspired his men. One of his officers said, "We knew at one stage that it was going to be a fight to the finish, but he was so cool about it, it was impossible for us to get excited." Over the 3 days, Currie barely got an hour's sleep, and when it was over, he fell asleep standing and then crashed to the ground. Currie's courage and devotion to duty had a far-reaching effect on the successful outcome of the battle. French-Canadian Corporal Leo Major was also in Normandy, where he captured a German armoured vehicle which held secret codes and lost an eye to a phosphorus grenade. He stayed in service, saying that he looked like a pirate. However, it wasn't in Normandy where Leo earned his first Distinguished Conduct Medal, but in the Netherlands in 1945. Actually, before we go there, Leo single-handedly captured 93 Germans in the Battle of Scheldt.
He captured 93 German soldiers by himself. Wow.
When out on a solo reconnaissance mission in 1944, he escorted all 93 of them back to his camp, where he would not accept a DCM because he considered the person awarding it to him to be incompetent. Back to 1945 and the real DCM. After breaking his back, ribs, and both ankles when the car he was in was hit by a landmine, Leo went on a recon mission with a friend in the city of Zwolle. His friend was killed, so Major continued alone, capturing a German soldier, making the soldier take him to his officer, who was in a bar, and then telling that German officer that the Canadian artillery was going to shell and kill them all. Leo then ran through the city, firing his gun and lobbing grenades, fooling the Germans into thinking the Canadian army was invading. All through the night, Major brought captured German troops back to his camp, resting in civilian houses whenever he needed to catch his breath. He then set a Gestapo HQ on fire and assaulted a Nazi SS HQ before meeting with members of the Dutch resistance and informing them that he had liberated the entire city by himself. I've got to say, that last one is pure insanity. What an absolute machine. Overall, based on the available evidence at least, I think Canadians in World War II abandoned their unofficial take no prisoner and kill the wounded policies of World War I. Obviously, this is a generalization, and the Vlieshoite incident certainly demonstrates that they were at least capable of unjust violence, though there is no comparing the deeds of the Canadians to, say, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Soviets. As evinced by the stories of Paul Triqueur, David Currie, and Leo Major, Canadian courage and formidability was in no short supply, and I believe modern-day Canadians should be proud of how the Canadian military cleaned up their act after World War I and made such a brave and significant contribution to an Allied victory in the Second World War.
The Netherlands in the spring. Beautiful. Flowers in full bloom, parks pristine, streets spotless. It's a far cry from what the same spots were like 70 years ago. The Germans had leveled the cities, murdered those who got in the way, and sent tens of thousands of Jews to be gassed in death camps. The Dutch who were left were starving after the 5 years of brutal Nazi occupation. By 1945, they were so hungry, some were eating tulip bulbs to stay alive.
The starved, rickets-ridden bodies of this Dutch family are witnesses to the treatment the Germans meted out to our friends in Holland.
That's when the Canadians arrived, blasting their way into towns like this one, Apeldoorn, crushing the Nazis, liberating the people. The Dutch have never forgotten, never. And this week, they'll be in these streets again, by the thousands, to welcome back some of those Canadians, now in their 90s, who gave them their country, their lives, back. I've been coming here for 20 years, never ceasing to be amazed at the Dutch determination to say thank you. This street with its pennants and Canadian flags is representative of many streets across the Netherlands right now, as the Dutch mark the major contribution that Canada played in the liberation of their country half a century ago.
I'm very young. I only heard stories from my grandfather and grandmother. But yes, they freed us 50 years ago, so that's why I'm here.
I think it's a love affair between the Canadians and the Dutch.
Well, 60 years is an awfully long time, but not long enough for the Dutch to forget the pain, the loss, the suffering, and the oppression of living under Nazi rule all those years during the Second World War. And not long enough either to forget the liberation and those who brought it to them.
It's a beautiful day. This is out of this world.
I'm feeling liberated.
107,000 people left this place on the trains destined for the death camps of Nazi-occupied Europe. 102,000 of them perished in those camps. On days like this, the Dutch come to remember what happened here more than 65 years ago.
The camp life was dominated by the train. The train was taking away 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 prisoners, and you prayed being not on the list.
Why do they never forget? Just listen to some of the stories we've heard over the years.
And I said, do you eat that every day? Sure. You want some? I'll give you a whole loaf. A whole loaf of white bread. I ran to the house and I planted it on the breakfast table and I said, here, look at it. Canadians are here.
Look at this street sign in an Apeldoorn suburb. If the name looks Canadian, it's because it is. A dozen streets in this neighborhood are named after one of the almost 8,000 Canadians who never came home from the battle. What was it about those young men who, through the generations, the Dutch won't stop thanking? Who were those guys? George Beale was one of them, a major with the 48th Highlanders. Every few days he'd stop and write a letter home to his wife, Ruth, in Toronto. This is one of them. Here's what he said. My own darling, I haven't written you for 5 days. I didn't feel much like it, sweetie, as we were fighting again, and I was awfully busy, and we've been having a tough fight. At the moment, I'm sitting in a city called Apeldoorn, and the Queen's Palace is within 100 yards of me. That's the Queen's Palace, right over there. We're about 100 yards from it. He might have been right here. We entered the town proper this morning after a big advance from the Isle River. I'm fine, Ruth, so don't worry, although I'm very tired. The enemy's running like the devil again, and we have to chase him. The fighting was bloody, and the dying. But through it all, George wrote to Ruth about the love he had for his men. He wrote this one on Sunday, April 22nd. I have fought and lived with those men for over a year, and to me they seemed as though they were part of my family. They never refused to go any place I ordered, and did everything I asked them to, cheerfully and willingly, knowing most of the time that I might be sending them to their deaths. There were lots of individual Canadian heroes here, Army men like George Beale, but Air Force flyers too. 50 years ago, these fields near Nistelrode in southeastern Holland were home base for a Royal Canadian Air Force Spitfire squadron. One of those Canadian pilots was a 22-year-old chap from Lethbridge, Alberta, whose name was Richard Odette. Well, near the end of December 1944, Odette had flown more than 50 missions. But up until that point, he had scored no German kills. Well, on the 29th of December 1944, all that changed. When Richard Odette flew out of one of these fields, he flew right into the history books. Before he returned, he had shot down 5 German aircraft. No other Canadian pilot, no other British pilot had scored that many victories in one mission. Meanwhile, frontline fighters broke through to capture key strategic locations. All this was happening as the Nazis were facing their final desperate days, until that last moment when the fighting and the dying suddenly stopped. 70 years ago this week, the war ended. And here's what George Beale wrote to Ruth on that same day. You can feel the emotion in his voice. Darling, you couldn't possibly have any idea just what kind of a reception it has been and still is. The people go simply mad. And I had the honor, darling, of being the leading vehicle, my Jeep. Any town we went through, the people crowded the roads and we had a most difficult time getting past them. They all want to touch your hand or even kiss you, and they simply pelted us with flowers. My Jeep looked like a florist shop. It does make all the hardships worthwhile when you see the joy of these liberated people. For this year's returning heroes, new medals from the local mayor.
Your memories, your thoughts guide us as we shape our future.
And new thoughts about an old battle.
Well, I was stationed here during the war as a Canadian Women's Army Corps, which I'm very proud of. And it brings back so many memories. And I always have a place in my heart for Holland, for Appledorn.
And it's a great, great day, you know. For the little thing we did, we get so much, 1,000 times more time.
The Dutch people are so
The Dutch people are the
faithful to
best
us.
people in the world, and I mean it.
Wangeningen just down the road from Appledorn, in that little building. That's where the Germans finally surrendered. These extraordinary pictures capture the moment.
To the Commander-in-Chief, 21 Army Group. These forces to lay down their arms and to surrender unconditionally.
And there at the table, Canadian General George Kitching, distinguished then and just as distinguished when I chatted with him at the same table 50 years later.
Wow.
How do you feel when you come back in this room?
It's almost as if they're ghosts, as if you are the German on the opposite side of the table, Peter. It was full of people then. Any movement, it was a very quiet room. And in spite of the fact that there were 30 Canadian reporters, they were quiet.
The general is gone now, and so are many of the men who fought with him. But the ones who are left, the ones who still come, the ones the Dutch, young and old, still so adore, are here with their memories. The ones that hurt, the ones that leave them quiet, and the ones that somehow make them smile.
I've never felt that I sacrificed anything to be part of a liberating army.
There were so many Canadians who lost their lives here in the Netherlands. How did you handle that on a day-to-day basis?
I put it out of my mind altogether, but nonetheless I cry when I go to the cemetery and see my friends' graves.
I never learned to cry. You just feel it inside.
What does it mean to you guys to be remembered the way you are here in this country, the way they look at you, the way they react to you?
Well, it's 70 years ago that we were here, but still, the kids are still enthusiastic about what we did here 70 years ago. And I love to see kids, the way they greet us and the way they look in such admiration at us, you know.
Really, it was something to feel the happiness, the joy of the liberation.
I asked the people I was staying with, what is this touching bit, you know? They asked permission to touch you, and I couldn't get over that, so they want to touch a liberator, and they want their children to touch a liberator.
20 years ago, I asked the then mayor of Appledorn why it was that the Dutch never forgot the Canadians. His answer was very simple, very direct. He said, you have to have been occupied to appreciate what freedom really means. And when you do, You never forget who gave it.
Wow.
To you. That's why Canada is never forgotten here. Never.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that in a kind of a somber kind of way. Just a side note on the Dutch. When Germany invaded the Netherlands, I believe the royal family escaped to Canada. And the Queen was pregnant. And in order to make the child eligible to inherit the throne, the Canadian government made her hospital room Dutch territory. So when the child was born, would be a Dutch citizen. For all those out there who have served in the armed forces, whether they be Canadian or American or British or Australian, I want to thank you for your service. So I can do stuff like this, have the freedom that I have. I thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.